There we go. See, we rallied. It's all good. Thank you for the multiple warm welcomes. Like, when does this happen, right? Before I get started talking about revival, I wanted to take a moment to introduce myself to all of you, especially because there are so many people in here that are new to me that I've never met before. So my name is Katie Pratt. I'm an architectural historian, public historian, and historic preservationist. I'm a dog mom to Madge, Winnie, and our recently departed Cece. I'm married to Darren, who's a second-generation shipyard worker, incredible home chef, and my #1 supporter. I love pop culture. My favorite class that I took in college was a history of pop culture course, which means I'm very, very good at 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. But please don't ask me to be on your trivia team for pop culture or history because I am terrible at remembering dates. Which is sort of hilarious given that I'm a historian, but that's what books are for, right? I have to reference everything anyway, so it's okay if I don't remember everything exactly date-wise. I'm also obsessed with overalls. I'm so grateful that they are back on trend so that I can find them in so many different styles. My high school self would just be so delighted. And then finally, well, I mean, it's hard to sum up your life on just a slide, right? So finally, just for this presentation, I'll say I'm completely in love with Bremerton. My love affair with Bremerton began before the pandemic when I married my husband and moved to actually Port Orchard, where he owned a house. I had lived in the Stadium District of Tacoma for several years, surrounded by old buildings. I lived right across from Wright Park. I was just immersed in what I love. So then when I moved to unincorporated Kitsap County, Port Orchard, I really dearly missed that sort of urban life. And so I started looking for places to spend more time that were a bit closer to my new home, and Bremerton, or more specifically at that time, Manette, scratched the itch for me. But then I learned about Heavy Jeans and First Friday Art Walk, which introduced me to downtown Bremerton and the Charleston Business District. And then I finally wore my husband down, and we moved to Bremerton at September of 2022. So, and the rest is history. He's like, keeps saying, you were so right, we should have done this years ago, because now his commute is not through Gorse traffic, it's 10 minutes from door to desk. It's amazing. So, moving on to the idea of revival. Revival is at the core of my work in historic preservation and public history, because restoring old, vacant, or underutilized buildings and filling them with new uses, revival. Writing about a place used by ordinary people, bringing their stories to life for new generations, revival. But before I get to this larger topic of revival, I first wanted to talk about my professional field, because as I mentioned, I'm an architectural historian. I work as a historic preservation consultant. My business is Northwest Vernacular. But what is historic preservation? I find that people actually interact with it quite a bit, but they don't actually know what it means or even realize that they're interacting with it. So I'm going to back up a bit to provide some more context, which is very on theme with the rest of my talk, and it was nice to hear that summary of revival included some of the buzzwords that I'm actually going to be using today. So historic preservation is within the larger field known as public history, and while public history is grounded in scholarship, just like academic history, it takes more of a collaborative approach, and it is ultimately about making history relevant to the public. Many different professions fall under that umbrella of public history. Historical consultants, museum professionals, government historians, archivists, oral historians, cultural resource managers, curators, film and media producers, historical interpreters, historic preservationists, policy advisors, local historians, and even community activists. And historic preservation is about the historic built environment and preserving and rehabilitating them for future generations. For the purposes of historic preservation, the built environment is broken down into 5 categories. We have sites, structures, objects, buildings, and districts. Sites are places like landscapes, parks, battlefields. Structures are built items that don't really house people, so think bridges, cranes, water towers. Agate Pass Bridge, for example, is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Objects can be things like ships or statues. Buildings, I hope, are fairly self-explanatory. And districts are a collection of any grouping of the previous 4 items. that may not have individual distinction, but their value comes from them as a group. So neighborhoods, like designed residential areas or commercial districts, but also college campuses or military facilities, and even neighborhoods or entire towns can all be districts. Port Gamble, for example, is a historic district. It's actually a National Historic Landmark District, so the highest of the high in our country. And then there are actually 5 different historic districts on Naval Base Kitsap. There's the shipyard itself, plus the officers' row, the former radio station, hospital reservation, and former Marine reservation. So those collections made the most sense to be made up together versus one big historic district. So while nostalgia has a place in preservation, it's much more than that. It's about understanding our collective history and how the built environment can be a tangible connection to the past. There's the phrase, out of sight, out of mind. If we tear down all that's been built by our ancestors, what will there be left to remind us of the incredible accomplishments and artisanship of our artists, trades and craftspeople, and of the things we wish we had done differently that we know we would do differently now with new information. The nonprofit advocacy organization Historic Seattle believes that historic places, quote, provide an essential link to the past, reminding us of who we are and where we came from, end quote. And I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment, which leads me to my broader discussion for today on revival. When I was asked to talk about the topic of revival, I thought it was quite fitting given that I work in historic preservation, especially because May is actually Historic Preservation Month nationwide. But also in terms of architectural styles, there is revival architecture. Well, here in Washington State, we don't have any buildings that reflect the colonial era of architecture that existed on the East Coast. We do have colonial revival. And just like the US does not have Jacobean or Tudor architecture, which you see on the left hand of your screen, we do have Tudor revival, which is on the right hand side. Revival architectural styles look to previous periods of architecture for inspiration, but they are not exact replicas or perfect imitations. They often borrow the language of that style, but incorporate new materials or make modifications to scale or size. And revival in this sense, as looking to the past to understand it, to learn from it, but not perfectly replicate it, is vital as we work to make our present and in turn our future better for our communities. Revival, in my opinion, can be about both story and place. And for my work, revival of story always needs to be where we start. It's the people and their connections to place that provide meaning to buildings and neighborhoods. Even if you don't know who designed or built a building that you find beautiful or interesting, or you just walk by every day on your walk, you can stop and appreciate that it was someone's vision and someone's hands that built that place. Because our history, our stories, they matter. Yes, I believe that history matters, and not in the idea of glorifying the past or going back to some idealized era. Because knowing our history can deepen our appreciation for what we have today, help us feel connected to our communities, and help us do better in the future. There's the phrase, those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it, or some variation of that, right? And I agree in a sense of that statement, of course. I'd like to encourage us all not to think about history as like a playbook for political strategy, or that by knowing the history you can somehow predict the future. That's kind of a lot to put on history, right? But instead, history is about context. Much of the work that I do researching, documenting, and analyzing historic properties is about understanding their significance, which is always revealed in light of its history, its context. And additional research can bring to light new information, providing even more context. So our understanding of place continues to grow and become more richer. And I think historic context, particularly when we're thinking about revival or revitalization, is all about authenticity, working to understand the story of a place, providing the fullest picture possible, helps put that building or site or structure in context so we can understand the who, what, when, where, and why. And as a historian, my approach and work to tell these stories continues to expand and grow, and I believe hopefully improve. You can think of my career over the last 15, 16 years, the work that I was doing when I first started, how much my field has grown in trying to tell the fuller story and connect with not just the typical stories that we see about folks who've built our buildings in the past. So First, I want to talk about an example of revival of story that I recently had the privilege to work on. Last year, I was hired to work on a project related to women's history in the state of Oregon. Because when you look up properties that have been designated to what's called the National Register of Historic Places, there are very few that have been designated for their association with women's history. Shocker, right? I mean, decades ago when they would list something, it would just be listed as the John Smith House. They wouldn't even include the woman's name if the wife was a part of the house, even though she was as much part of that story as he was, right? So my colleague and I were charged with developing a historic context statement of women's history covering the entire state of Oregon. So without getting into the weeds, obviously, that was a very tall order. So luckily, and a budget, so we had to be thoughtful about this. But we were given leeway in developing an approach and decided to focus in on women's labor history. Because, and I love that there are so many women in this room, because as we began our research in women's history, the ongoing and constant thread running throughout any discussion of women is that we have always worked, whether we've been paid or not. We narrowed in on a period of about 90 years in Oregon history and devoted our research and writing to women's paid labor during that time. We learned about the laws that impacted women in their work and how a century ago was a very paternalistic view in how they passed the laws to protect women, but which actually hindered them in developing in the workforce. And then we carried that history all the way up to when the first woman was elected as governor of the state of Oregon in 1990. And I could go on and on about this project, and I would love to chat with any of you about it, because to date it is the work I am the most proud to have completed. And you might wonder, what does that have to do with the theme of revival? And while I would say all my projects have had an impact on me to some extent, this one embodies for me the idea of understanding our past in order to shape our future. Because when you learn the history, the story, it changes how you view your community around you, and it can ignite in you a will and a desire to make an impact. Because I'm a woman in the workforce, and I faced a lot of the challenges that women have faced. Harassment, mansplaining, but I've never been pregnant and I'm not a mother. But while I was working on this project, I became the primary caregiver for my father as he was treated for acute myeloid leukemia, or AML, which included moving him into my home in January of last year and then over to Seattle for a period of 4 months while he had a bone marrow transplant. And so as I was caring for my dad, taking him to every doctor's appointment, blood draw, transfusion, infusion, and test, all while researching and writing about the women who have gone before me. This is what I was doing, who were also the caretakers for their loved ones while juggling relationships, career responsibilities, and self-care. To read about studies done in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s to unpack the barriers to employment faced by women and feel like those studies could have been written yesterday or today. Barriers like lack of affordable childcare being written about in 1958, or paid family leave, which are still problems today, right? And through caring for my dad, while still needing to do paid work as a small business owner, I experienced such a tremendous weight, and I think a lot of women can relate to this. I was struggling to be there fully for my dad because I still needed to work, but I also wanted to work because I loved what I was doing and I was so excited about it. But as I expanded my knowledge of the past, of the experiences of women in the workforce decades before I started working, I developed a profound understanding of my present and the future I wanted for myself and for my community. Women have made tremendous advances in the workforce in the last century, but there is still so much work to be done. The COVID-19 pandemic in particular has demonstrated how fragile career advancement has been for many women across the nation. When schools and childcare facilities shuttered their doors during the pandemic's lockdowns, millions of women left the workforce, either because their jobs no longer existed or they had to care for their children. A 2023 article published in Human Rights Magazine stated that in February 2021, quote, women's labor force participation hit a low last seen in 1988, losing an entire generation of gains, end quote. Women experienced more job loss during the pandemic, and the female workforce has been slower to recover than the male workforce. Industries that employ more women were hit the hardest by pandemic job loss, such as leisure and hospitality, retail, education, and healthcare. And then Black women and Latina women were also impacted more severely than white women. It is clear that 2020 and the subsequent pandemic years will be another defining moment in history for women at work. But for me, this work helped me understand my place in this world as the link in the chain of women at work, that because women who fought for their rights decades before I was born were actually fighting for my rights. The experience of learning and writing about the generations of women that have preceded me in work was equal parts inspiring and illuminating. And I'm sure you can tell I get a little worked up about it. And it's like, as a historian, living through like a historic moment like the pandemic is a little overwhelming at times. And then I was a full-time caretaker while writing about women, researching and writing about women and their struggles. But also their advancements and achievements. It just made the whole experience very poignant for me. And it only served to solidify my belief as a historian that understanding our past is vital as we do the work of shaping our communities for the present and future. The work that many of us do in this room, paid and unpaid, is because yes, we want our communities better for ourselves, but also for future generations, our children, our grandchildren, our nieces, nephews, our neighbors. And for me, that work is revival. My work on Oregon women's history was just the first phase in a project. The next phase is to identify the places associated with women's labor history. But that looking back, that research and context provides the revival of story that can hopefully lead to a revival of place. That in knowing the story, we look at places differently, and in this instance, consider the role women may have played in building and shaping the built environment around us. Because revival is not about repeating over and over again the same work, or even continuing to do the things the same way just because that's the way it's always been done. Revival is about discernment, learning from past practices, understanding the why, celebrating when it was good, acknowledging and making restitution for the bad, and then using those lessons learned. Revival is not demolition or progress at any cost. Revival is not pure nostalgia. In terms of historic preservation, it's about breathing new life into historic places, respecting the investment that was made by those who came before us, but incorporating new uses. An incredibly beautiful example of revival that I've recently worked on, which includes revival of story and place, is the former Immigration and Assay Station building in Seattle. And there's incredible tension in this building's history. The Immigration Station and Assay Office was built in 1931 to house two different offices of the federal government in Seattle, an immigration station to serve as the entry and exit point for immigrants arriving in Seattle, and an assay office to analyze and process gold and silver bullion and foreign coins, because we had the gold rush, people going up to Alaska, coming back with all their gold, and they needed to process it. So the building was constructed on the southwestern edge of the Chinatown International District, and it was in use by the federal government until 2004. It eventually became just the immigration station when the assay office closed in 1955. It was a place where folks went for their swearing-in ceremonies as they became citizens, but it was also where immigrants were detained and some indefinitely incarcerated pending deportation. The walls of the second floor exterior courtyard, which you can see in the upper right and the lower left, are covered in the names of detainees who used the roofing tar that was warmed by the sun to mark their presence on the walls to say that I was here, because it was their only chance to see sunlight, because otherwise they were inside all the time in jail cells. There's much more nuance and history to the story of this place, but in the early 2000s, the building was closed and the government sold it. But now, one of the building's primary uses is as artist studios. A place of imprisonment is now a place of creation, with interpretive panels at the entrance, ensuring all visitors to the building do not forget its history. And they are very, it's hard to say proud of the history, but like they know the history of the place, the artists, and they are not scared to talk about it and realize what's gone before. And I think there's such value and beauty in that, in recognizing what happened, even if there's pain and tension. But also it was great for people who were so excited to become US citizens. So that tension, we don't need to ignore the tension. We can sort of live into it and embrace. And I think this space is why it's such a beautiful example of that revival of story and place, and how the two can go hand in hand so well. So with that, I just wanted to leave you with a couple thoughts to ponder, thinking about what places matter to you in your community, and what places do you see in your community that are neglected? Do you know their stories? Is the place and its stories in need of revival? And what can that look like for you, personally, as well as in your places of influence? So with that, thank you so much for letting me share a bit about the passion I have for the work that I do. I'm extremely privileged to have a career that I love, that allows me to see value in so many places and learn so much about my community's history. Thank you.